You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, bitch! Please let me see your ticket stubs for the double-edged double bill. Tonight, Freddy Krueger gives us a final new nightmare at Elm Street. Each week, Adam Thomas and Thomas Mariani will come to the table to discuss the randomly selected yin and yang of a double feature. Then, both will have to pick a number between 1 and 10 in order to seal their fates for the next episode. Bitch! One will have 2 good movies, the other 2 bad ones. Welcome to prime time, bitch! And I'm Adam Thomas, bitch.
And I am Thomas Mariani. I'll get you, my pretty, and your little soul, too!
Oh, God.
Everyone's favorite Freddy line. There's no other great Freddy line at all. None whatsoever. And here to continue proving that theory is one of the various children of Elm Street, because every town has an Elm Street. It is Mr. Desmond Alexander Peel. Desmond, how are you doing?
Let's get high. Yeah, how you guys doing?
We're doing great, but we are a clean show. We are a family show, as you could tell from Adam's language.
Yeah, real.
Well, I guess it's time for me to go ahead and make my exit.
And that was Desmond's time on the show. We really appreciate it.
No problem, anytime.
Desmond, of course, you're on for this particular episode, which is all about Freddy Krueger and Nightmare on Elm Street, because we're celebrating 35 years of this particular series, which started weirdly in November of 1984, which I found out recently that's so odd it came out like the week after Halloween. In 84.
As you were saying that, it just reminded me of how old I am, because I'm 35, and now hearing it's the 35th anniversary coming up, it just reminds me, oh my God, I'm as old as this movie.
I'm 36, so why don't you go play with the other kids? Yeah. That's ridiculous. 35 years, man.
We're covering 2 films that sort of deal with Freddy after a certain sort of cultural zeitgeist point. Because obviously in 84, Nightmare on Elm Street blew up and it spawned several sequels to varying degrees of quality, let's just say. Because we've covered other horror franchises on here, Adam, like Friday the 13th or Halloween. And we can definitely say that Nightmare on Elm Street isn't the most consistent, necessarily, of these franchises.
Yeah, I think you and I have actually been saying that for a couple of years at this point, to where out of all the most beloved franchises, this one is the most flip-floppy. This one didn't know what it wanted to do until I'd say part 4, when he really started getting comedic, and then they just kind of stuck with that.
Well, I would argue there's a gradual sort of shift from, the original Nightmare on Elm Street Freddy is sort of grounded, has a bit of playfulness, progressively becomes more of, sort of comedic character, because obviously at this time the sort of slasher typical character of Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees didn't really speak, didn't have much of a personality, versus Freddy, being played by Robert Englund so consistently, had a personality that I think gradually became more and more comedic as time went on. But Desmond, I know you decided to come on here, and I've talked with you previously on your own show, Desmond's Flicks, about a couple of Wes Craven films, and this is obviously the brainchild of Wes Craven. So it's safe to say Freddy has a place close to your heart there?
Yeah, Nightmare on Elm Street was the first horror film I saw when I was about 5 years old, and that was what made me a horror fan. Freddy was my favorite growing up. It was Freddy and the Crypt Keeper. That was when kids were watching their, Saturday morning cartoons, that was my, the thing that I liked, Freddy and the Crypt Keeper. And I remember seeing Freddy's Dead in theaters with my family opening weekend with the 3D glasses and everything, and it was an event. And over time, my feeling about the franchise as a whole has changed, but that first film and also part 3, those really are films that I hold close to my heart.
Well, and then what's your history with it, Adam? Where did you first remember sort of getting into Freddy Krueger as a horror character?
The first thing I remember with Freddy Krueger was the scene in part 4 where the girl turns into the roach. And he squashes her in like the giant roach motel. I remember seeing that when I was real young, and it scared the piss out of me to the point where I didn't visit the franchise till well into my teens. I started my slasher, love with like Michael Myers and Jason, and then when I finally graduated to Freddy, I really did grow to love the character because it was something different. He did talk. He's a real sick fuck, like the basis for the character and everything. And just Robert Englund plays him with such relish and just joy and love for the character. But yeah, as I've gotten older and revisited it, several times, there's a lot of good, but there's a lot of shit too.
I do agree, because along with visiting our 2 films, which we'll specifically mention in a bit, I did rewatch a couple of the other ones that I hadn't seen in a while. There's at least a lot of experimentation that I appreciate, because with like the sort of Friday the 13th or Halloween, you kind of get very familiar kills most of the time, and the most that it kind of experiments is like, oh, Michael Myers ripped some dude's throat out, or something like that, as opposed to like, even in something like Dream Master, you're still getting weird things like he eats souls out of like little pizzas that have like little meatball heads and shit like that. There's at least some kind of experimentation, something very different and wide-ranging with every movie. And for me, actually my first exposure, much like I think most pop culture in general, was to Nightmare on Elm Street was through The Simpsons, because of the Groundskeeper Willie Treehouse of Horror parody. It was only the first time I was aware of what Freddy was. But then again, Freddy Krueger was also kind of like how I talked about with Candyman in our Clive Barker episode a few weeks ago, is sort of this character that kids recognize as just sort of like a cultural figure, even if they haven't seen any of the movies. He's like Santa Claus or King Kong, to quote New Nightmare specifically. And so I was aware of what Freddy was, and I was terrified of that concept. But I didn't really visit the first movie, which was the first one I saw, until I was a teenager, and I knew friends who loved the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, and I just sheepishly admitted I hadn't seen any. And what's so interesting is really that first one especially is a very sort of naturalistic horror movie. It's weird, this would obviously go so cartoony with the rest of the series, but the first one feels like a very genuine sort of like suburban neighborhood being attacked by a malicious spirit that's been like sort of haunting the entire town for ages. And it still really holds up. I still would say it's the best one of the franchise.
Freddy had personality in the first one, a lot of personality. They tried to overdo it with his personality. Once you make Freddy Krueger not scary anymore, then you kind of lose the whole franchise, in my opinion.
He basically turned into like Spuds McKenzie. Like, he gradually became a commercial mascot further and further. Dream Master looks like a fucking commercial. Like, the entire movie is basically like a late 80s TV commercial through and through, sponsored by Freddy.
Absolutely. Especially the beach scene.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, after the first film, I feel like 3 is the best sequel in my opinion. Part 2 is close to my heart as well. I love that movie. But as it progresses after 4, that's the point where Freddy Krueger became too cartoonish, and there was nothing really scary about him. And it started in Part 4 a lot with the direction of that, and that was by the director who did Die Hard 2.
Yeah, Randy Harlan, yes.
Yeah. And it had that, action movie vibe to it. I liked it when I was a kid because I thought it was cool, seeing all these spectacular effects. But as I'm older, I appreciate their earlier films a lot more, especially 1, 2, and 3. Once we get into 5 and 6, it's just full-on cartoon. And I like him to be still sadistic and still saying like all of his one-liners, but not be full-on cartoon, and not have really bright light shining on him like in Part 6 in Freddy's Dead.
Yeah, I think that's as good as a point as any to actually transition into our 2 movies, because if you're new to Double Edge Double Bill, At the end of our last episode, we did some random picking where I had 2 bad movies that were in this franchise, and Adam had 2 good ones. And what we ended up with was 2 films that followed each other very closely, the 6th and 7th entries in this franchise. With first, we're going to talk about Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, which is our first pick from 1991, our bad pick. And then we'll transition into our good pick, which was Part 7, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which came out in 1994. But let's get up to all the plastic, shiny wonderfulness of Freddy's Dead.
As a boy, he was always different, but now it's a new beginning. The beginning of the end for Freddy.
Every town has an Elm Street.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little soul, too.
Now I'm playing with power. What's with kids today, huh?
Freddy's Dead, the final nightmare. They saved the best for last.
So yeah, Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare came out September 13th, 1991. Oh, Friday the 13th. How spooky.
Oh.
Yes, yes. And it was directed by Rachel Talalay, who interestingly was with the franchise from the start. She was originally a production manager on the first 2 movies, and then was a line producer on Dream Warriors, and then became a producer full-fledged on 4 and 5. And she actually directed some other stuff after this, including a lot of really great episodes of the recent Doctor Who series, particularly with Peter Capaldi, a lot of great episodes from that show. And this was New Line Cinema, which was famously called the house that Freddy built, because when that came out in 1984, Bob Shea, who created New Line, basically got his studio to go from like a very minor independent studio into being one of the mini majors of sorts of that time. They had gone through 5 Nightmare movies, and then realized, you know what, we're running out of steam with Freddy, let's just make it all out and kill Freddy Krueger. And they did, wink wink, with what is quite frankly a live-action cartoon, and not a good one.
Yeah.
I think, is this the worst one?
Yep.
Yes.
Even including the remake?
Yes.
Okay. We're all in agreement then. That's great.
I fucking hate this movie.
Thank you.
It's so unbelievably bad. All around. The way it's lit, the way it's shot, the way it's directed, the way the characters are, the actors, everything. Nothing for me in this movie works. Not a single fucking thing. Except Freddy's daughter as a little girl. Spoiler alert. She's adorable. Arnett, yeah, I'm good. Oh, Alice Cooper, too. Yeah, why not?
It's the only cameo that might somewhat work, I guess. Arguably.
Yeah.
Is Desmond about to, like, entertain, like, come on, guys, Tom, Earl, and Roseanne. So great. I love seeing this together.
No. Oh my god. Yeah, I echo everything that you just said, Adam. Fuck this movie. I had to split this up over 2 sessions because I was watching it last night and I fell asleep in the middle of it. And then I finished watching it today and it was just like, oh my god, this is such a struggle to watch. This is so terrible. And again, I remember seeing this in theaters opening weekend. I was so excited. And I was super bummed when I was a kid.
You didn't like it then? Oh, wow.
No. This was my least favorite as a kid. I hated it. And I was so let down between this and Jason Takes Manhattan, like the late 80s for me with my slashers. I was kind of broken.
Well, especially it's weird because this is like technically early 90s, and this was at a point where the slasher was like long dead. Because that started around like the mid 80s. It was starting to like go into decline. And then by this point, it's pretty much just like Freddy's like one of the last vestiges of it that's still kind of crawling around just because of the sort of IP angle of it. And this is definitely full-fledged. We're not in slasher territory anymore. We have this big opening sequence that is a series of Freddy imitates the Wicked Witch of the West, followed by the "Don't nobody scream while the boss is in motion," like all this other stuff. This is full-fledged, like what everybody thinks of Freddy Krueger to this point. It's just like, oh, he is a mascot for horror more than he is any kind of like actual menacing killer. You could, I would argue, maybe be able to make some kind of like fun, like meta-contextual, interesting movie out of this kind of conceit of doing like, we're gonna go full-fledged cartoon, weird, dream logic movie out of Freddy Krueger. The problem is this movie wants to kind of like have its cake and eat it too, where it's like, we're gonna do that, but we're also gonna mix it up with like this whole mystery about Freddy's kid, because it's initially this John Doe dude who we think, oh, it's his son, and then eventually, oh no, actually, the psychiatrist lady who's in the Springwood that is completely absent of children except for these Wayward children who were suddenly involved, is actually his daughter, and there's a lot of creepy stuff about, like, spousal abuse, and with another character, like, child molestation, and some other stuff. It's like, it doesn't fit at all. This is such a complete mess of a movie that I'm not sure, like, what the fuck they were even going for at all.
No, and the thing is, like, even the serious part with, like, the child abuse and everything is almost played for laughs. And it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I mean, don't get me wrong. Billy Zane in a wig does all right. I mean, she tries. But it's... I mean, dude, she looks exactly like him.
Yeah.
But,
Yes, Lisa Zane, who is the sister of Billy Zane. They look. There's a family resemblance. That's very clear.
but what a fucking cheap tactic. It's just... I hate you, Thomas, for picking this fucking movie.
Well, you know, we had to really go with, like, the lowest of the low, I would argue.
And this is easily the lowest of the low, yeah.
Yeah, because especially since so much of it is a bad comedy, like, all of the laughs are so poor. Like, you don't laugh at it. I think especially the, like, complete bottoming out is really the Breckenmeyer video game sequence is, like, one of the worst things I've ever seen in a big-budget studio movie. Because it's this series of, like, just random ideas about, like, this is what the MTV generation wants, let's just throw this at them. That's what it feels like. This feels like Studio Notes the movie. The whole fucking movie.
Oh, absolutely. Now we're playing it with power. Great graphics. Oh, stop. Stop. This is what the kids like. They like Tiger Electronics, and they like Power Gloves. And they're like, nobody liked the Power Glove, and nobody ever liked Tiger Electronics. Stop it. It's 40 to 50-year-old men in suits sitting in a room like, this is what teenagers are into. What? Wizard of Oz? What the fuck? This is ridiculous. This is just pure garbage, and the makeup on Robert Englund is
oh my god.
It looks like the shit you buy at like a Walgreens burned man mask.
not even the officially licensed Warner Brothers one.
No, yeah, it's like burned man. You know, you put it on. That's this makeup. It's horrible.
He looks like an action figure. He just looks like they just
completely.
put the action figure in stop motion and just made it into fucking Freddy. Which is a bummer, because I would argue at least that even as terrible as this movie is, Robert Englund's just kind of desperately clawing and trying to make this work, and he just can't. He's just too, like, committed an actor to not realize this is all bullshit.
Yeah, he's going to do whatever they tell him to do. I mean, he loves the character. He loves the source material. I mean, it's not really up to him what happens, unfortunately. I mean, but he just wants to keep playing the character because he loves it. But good God.
To piggyback off of the whole, the makeup part, it's also so badly lit that it you can tell that it's fake. And to me, it just makes me think of, okay, little kids love Freddy, so let's make Freddy more accessible and not make him so scary, and so he's more like a Saturday morning cartoon. Even though he's a child murderer, and it's alluded to, especially in the first film, that he's a child molester, and you're trying to make him more accessible to kids in this film, and it doesn't work. And I don't really get why they had Rachel Talalay direct this film as her first film, because the direction in this film is just god awful. But I can see how her type of aesthetic works well for television, because it just does feel like a television show.
Well, especially finding out through, if you've never seen it, the big Nightmare on Elm Street documentary, Never Sleep Again, which is
fantastic.
Yeah, 4 hours just like detailing the production of every single movie. They talk about the fact that a lot of the crew was actually from John Waters movies, because she also produced Crybaby, amongst a few other John Waters movies. And you can tell that like this is people who think they know what camp is, but they have no idea how that actually works.
Right.
It's not that they don't know how camp works. It's that camp doesn't apply to this idea. They try. I mean, they make this movie campy, but when you set it against the backdrop of a child murdering, molesting dream demon, it just comes off stupid.
I think it would work better, though, if you just completely ignored trying to cover any sort of serious aspect of Freddy's backstory, which they emphasize on in a really weird move, like, hey, let's make our big show-stopping climax 3D sequence revolve around the history of this, like, child-molesting killer. Like, the entire, like, all the playbook of, like, all the serial killer bullshit. I'm just like, he killed small pets, check. He had an abusive dad, check. In the same movie where, not 30 minutes ago, he has a bed of nails that he puts underneath somebody who's falling like he's Bugs Bunny. So it's just like, it's tonal whiplash to the point where your neck will, like, snap in 2 or 5 pieces by the end of it. It's so much tonal whiplash all over the place.
Yeah, dude, he's Wile E. Coyote half the fucking movie. I have no problem with taking franchises in different directions. You know, a lot of times it doesn't work, sometimes it really does. But I appreciate the effort. And I do like the idea that they threw Rachel Talalay a bone. She's been on it since the beginning, so, you know, hey, why don't you direct it? Great. But for such a paramount idea that this movie was supposed to be, I mean, the death of Freddy Krueger, you're 6 movies in, it's a huge franchise. Maybe do it with somebody who not only A, appreciates the films before it, but B, will honor the idea. Like, it's a little late in the game to be like, oh, I'm going to make it something completely different that's come before, and it's the last one.
Well, it feels almost like they kind of picked her because of, like, throwing a bone of, like, hey, you get to direct this now, but also at the same time, but we're going to totally take advantage of your inexperience. Because it definitely feels like it's just, they didn't give her any kind of voice, which is, it's a shame she's the only female director of any of these movies, and you have a really cool idea of, hey, the daughter of Freddy Krueger, who's been, like, separated from this whole time, now has to face off against him. That's a really cool idea, but they completely sideline it, and Lisa Zane character in general, for all these elaborate set pieces that we've been referencing, like the Breckenmeyer one, or the, even the Carlos one, which I would argue...
Oh, God.
I'd argue that kind of has the most interesting kind of, like, idea about it, of taking advantage of, like, this character who's deaf, and his, like, oversensitive hearing. I think that's an interesting concept. It's just, once again, very cartoonish in its execution, and it's just kind of played for all these, like, really lame gags. And that's the thing, it's just, like, it feels so much like, hey, we want to just kind of emphasize fully on, let's have all these, like, big set pieces that feel like little commercials, little vignettes, and not actually have any kind of a story whatsoever.
Yeah, I think I actually do agree, too, with the Carlos thing. You know, nice hearing from you, Carlos. Really stupid. But I do like the idea that Freddy's playing on his vulnerabilities. Ultimately, you don't give a shit. I mean, do you? Do you really care?
It's systematic of a lot of things that we're developing, even from, like, 4, especially, I agree with Desmond said earlier, from Dream Master on, it is just, like, all of these, like, characters who are maybe not the most developed characters like the earlier movies, but at the very least felt like kind of, like, real or somewhat interesting kids have been turned into, you have 2 traits, and Freddy's going to emphasize on at least one of them for the dream later on. And this is like that to the umpteenth degree.
Oh, yeah, 100%. These are literally just body count actors. That's the whole point.
And that's not what the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise is about. When you look at Friday the 13th, especially, that's all about body count. With Nightmare, I feel like because the first 3 films especially played it a lot more darker, and they really handled the themes of being a teenager, not feeling like you belong, and also the theme of teenage suicide really well. in those two films, especially in the 80s. You know, it's our mindset about those things were very different back then. With this film, it almost feels like disrespectful to those earlier films that really set up the character, the struggle between the kids that are being victimized by him because of the sins of their parents, through their dreams where they're most vulnerable. And in this film, it just shits all over it. And you have this asshole John Doe being introduced, who I can't fucking stand. And it just shits on the franchise. There's nothing that I can find of value at all in this movie. There's nothing good about it. And Robert Englund can be good in anything. He's good in The Mangler, and The Mangler is a piece of shit. But, you know, no matter how much you try, you can't polish up this turd, and it's a fucking turd.
Kids, am I right?
Fuck.
No, I totally agree with what Desmond's talking about, because like what's so ingenious about the first Nightmare on Elm Street is it's about these kids who find a connection with each other, but are constantly alienated by adults around them who, as it turns out, are alienating them because they feel so guilty about like these sins coming back, and they're feeling like, nope, I can't even acknowledge it whatsoever. This is just something random that's happening. It has nothing to do with my past actions. And you would figure, once again, with the whole like Freddy and his daughter thing, that's like the perfect potential to like have all of those themes come home to roost. And once again, it's just kind of done like, well, we'll toss it off as we give this big 3D like climax, which is incredibly lazy, especially to the point where Yaphet Kotto, who by the way is in this movie, it so sucks that he's doing nothing. It's awesome. Ask Yaphet Kotto, and he's just like, yeah, if I'm in a sweater, I'm just hanging out here. Hey, put on these 3D glasses. You can do anything with them in the dream, I guess.
And I'll tell you this, it was lame then as well. Watching this with my parents and my older brother, we put on those glasses, and I was stoked. I was excited for what they were going to do. And when it was done, it was like, wait, that's it? Like, his head just explodes and goes into itself over and over again? Fuck you.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty bad. I don't know what else we have to say about it. Maybe we go into final thoughts at this point. Because yeah, it's everything that's bad. So, Desmond, your final thoughts on Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare?
Fuck this movie. It's just not good. It's lazy. To what you guys were saying earlier, it feels like a bunch of suits in a room came up with an idea and gave it to an inexperienced director who was just so excited to be on a project and be the director that she just fell in line. And, you know, not to shit on her too much, but this shouldn't have been given to her. This should have been given to a director who had a bit more experience. But knowing how Bob Shea was and is, he liked to find a director that was the cheapest and that would do the most work for as little money as possible. So yeah, my rating would be fuck this movie.
We don't usually do ratings, but that's a pretty accurate rating. Just fuck this movie. By the way, speaking of Bob Shea, he has a cameo in like all these movies. This is easily the worst one, right?
Yeah.
Where it's just like, oh, dude, get a ticket for the bus. He's got the Freddy glove on. It's like, oh. Oof. It's pretty bad. Adam, your final thoughts on this movie?
This is easily my least favorite film in all of the horror slasher franchises. I think this is just pure, unintelligible shit. I think it offers nothing to the source material and only detracts from the entire picture as a whole. There's no redeemable part of this movie. It's not funny. It's not scary. It's not well directed. It's not well shot. The makeup's terrible. The effects are awful. It's just a really, really, really shit fest of a film.
Yeah, and it's one that I've seen get a bit more slack where people say, well, it's terrible, but it's no Dream Child, or some people say Freddy's Revenge, or some of these other things. But even at some of their worst, like, I have a lot of issues with Dream Child, but that at the very least is kind of doing a bit more ambitious, interesting ideas in concept, as opposed to this is just completely, as you mentioned, devoid of any real vision or cohesion or anything much of interest. It just is, it's a movie where they don't know what to do, so it's like, hey, let's slide out a cameo. Hey, let's slide out this cool visual thing that's a reference to, you know, whatever thing kids like at the time. Let's toss out these references to Freddy's past and all this other stuff. It just feels like it's a grab bag of various different ideas. I would say it's definitely one of the worst examples of the trope of Flanderization, which is basically, hey, let's take this character who initially started off with like an interesting kind of fun trait we kind of played on a bit and completely play it out as time goes along. And this is like the bottom of the barrel for Freddy Krueger. For sure, even as bad as that remake is, at least Jackie Earle Haley is trying a bit more than I would say Robert Englund is.
That's about the best you can give him. But
yep.
Yeah,
yes,
I agree.
That's about the best you can say. And now here's a show on the ESO network that you can be listening to right now.
On the last episode of the Nerdy Laser podcast, Richard and Isaac found themselves in a highly secured government facility.
Richard, what are we gonna do?
Isaac, the only thing we can do.
You don't mean...
Yes, talk about movies, pop culture, and the nerdy stuff we love.
Right on!
The Nerdy Laser podcast is available on Podbean, Apple Podcast, and the ESO Network.
Let's go to somebody taking the reins of the franchise back and doing something very interesting with it, with Wes Craven's New Nightmare.
Coming from New Line Home Video, from Wes Craven, creator of A Nightmare on Elm Street, comes a new dimension in terror.
Miss me? Almost there.
Heather Langenkamp, John Saxon, and Robert Englund.
Never played in the cat.
Wes Craven's New Nightmare. This time, staying awake won't save you.
Meet your maker.
So, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, the 7th entry in the franchise, came out October 14th, 1994, celebrating the 10th anniversary at that time of the franchise, and features the return of Wes Craven to the director and writer's chair, after he had directed and written the first movie, and written at least the initial drafts of Dream Warriors, the third film. And I would say, with this franchise, a sort of essential trilogy, I would argue, is definitely that first one, Dream Warriors, and New Nightmare. And I think a lot of that has to do with Wes Craven, being the guy who created Freddy, had the most interesting sort of twists and turns of where to take the character to some extent. Because with those three movies, you get the initial start of Freddy, the darker start, then you get something that's a bit of a balance between his darker roots and the more comedic turns he would take, but actually kind of still worked. And then New Nightmare is really taking that conceit of like, oh, Freddy has become so tired out at this point that we have to take a very meta-contextual version of what we do with the character. And doing a pretty amazing job with it, and very innovative for the time.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I mean, that's why I chose this one. And, hey, I mean, dude, I love the look of Freddy in this movie. It's so good. It's such a different and fresh approach that has really never been taken in any of these franchises before. To look at it like, all right, look, this is what we did. This is how big it got. Now we're going to change everything we've already done. What if this was actually real because we all believed it and followed it and it made so much money and all became this thing? So now this real evil is taking on this personification of something that we all recognize and cherish and love. And this is what's going to happen. It's so different and original and cool.
It's very much taking sort of like that sins of the father approach of the original movie and putting it literally in the hands of the audience. Like, you are the person who sinned and created this monster, pretty much, by making Freddy so beloved. Which, especially, like, one of my favorite scenes in any of these movies is the whole talk show bit, where you see Freddy come out. It's very much typical of, like, what you would have seen in, like, the late 80s, early 90s, and just putting as, like, this is, like, oh, this fun thing that you watched as a kid, like, oh, look, Freddy's on a talk show. And really, it's like, oh, this is, like, feeding the flames of demons that actually populate the world and actually end up murdering people.
Right, and it's fucked up because it's a bunch of kids wearing the masks and shit, and they all get excited for them.
Yeah.
Where it's, I mean, dude, the basis of this character that's pretty dark.
So Desmond, I know based on our previous talks, you're a big Wes Craven fan. But what are your feelings on New Nightmare, and where would you put it amongst the franchise?
Yeah, I love Wes Craven, and even when he's misfired in a film, there's something about his dedication to the craft, and he's a director that I really admire because you can tell how much he loves the horror genre and how he tries something different every single time he makes a film. And I find that so admirable. And in this film, although not my favorite in the franchise, it's probably like middle of the pack is where I'd put it. I still like it and I still enjoy it. I find that this film was really cool about the time that it came out because it came out 2 years before Scream came out. So we're getting this whole meta aspect to horror and talking about those horror tropes and who Freddy was originally and what he's become and why he's not scary anymore. And I also feel like it's like a post-mortem as well on a horror and especially slashers of the mid to late 80s and early 90s, and kind of a soft reset in a way for slashers and horror films. Of course, the big reset was Scream that basically said, hey, everyone, you need to up your game. But I felt like this was what the franchise needed because especially after part 5, the series really lost its touch and it lost everything that the franchise was about. And what Adam was saying earlier about even like part 3, he has some of his lines, his quippy lines, but there's still that sense of like this, he's dangerous. He's going to fucking kill you and he's frightening. I mean, there's that whole puppet piece in Dream Warriors in part 3, where he's using a guy as a puppet. Like that's horrifying. And we lost all that as the franchise went along. And so it was good, especially for me seeing this in 94. I saw it with my mom when it came out. We were so happy after we watched this because it was like a return to form of what Nightmare on Elm Street and what Freddy used to be, and especially what slashers used to be.
I completely agree with it being really much like a sort of eulogy for the slasher genre, because this was around the time when it was just, like, pretty much dead, unless it was, like, some bad, like, almost straight-to-video quality. And this is around the same time as, like, Halloween 6. The slasher genre is this shambling corpse that's still just kind of existing. And this feels very much like a passing of a torch where it's like, okay, these traditional slashers are very much dead, so let's do something very different with it. And Adam was talking earlier about the redesign of Freddy. I very much agree with like the redesign where he looks a lot more like he's not so much a burn victim as much as like he's the sort of cracks that happen in his face are sort of part of the original design anyway. It's like he is this sort of demon that's almost trying to get out of his human form. And that even works with like Robert Englund's performance where this is the scariest Freddy, I would argue.
Oh yeah, no.
In terms of like he feels like a malicious, animalistic character who even like the few lines he says are almost him grasping at straws of humanity to like try and like somewhat seem human when really he's just like this animalistic murderer. Especially with like my favorite scene of the whole movie is the sort of version they do of the Tina death from the original.
Yes.
Where it's such a great example of like how to sort of do a homage or a nod where it's like, oh, remember this horrible violent murder, but the whole thing was, oh, you didn't see the killer? In this case, we're going to see the killer grab this girl and put her around the room, upside down on the ceiling, but it's going to feel like a literal murderer is dragging this woman across the fucking ceiling, and it's disturbing. It's unsettling.
It is, but Miko Hughes, good lord. He kind of shits the bed.
he literally looks like he's making a poopy pants face in that scene. Like, I agree that he's probably the biggest issue I have with the movie. He's always been. Miko Hughes, of course, you would recognize from Pet Sematary, where, of course, that worked because he was, like, a year and a half old. He didn't really have so much of, like, awkward kid acting, as opposed to here, there's a lot of points where it's, especially him trying to be possessed by Freddy. Like, there's that point where he does the, like, never sleep again, and he sounds like Donald Duck.
That's the problem with child actors. You never really know what you're going to get with the child actor, and if they're going to be able to hit the mark, and he feels uneven, but it's like, I'm able to give him more slack because he is a kid. Thankfully, Heather Langenkamp is in the film, and I don't care what anyone says, I know that she gets some shit for the first Nightmare on Elm Street and that her acting is bad. I think that she was great in that movie. I thought she was great in Part 3, and I think she's great in this movie. And it's so nice to see her in a Nightmare on Elm Street film again with Wes Craven. You see her with Robert Englund and John Saxon, things like that. Those are the things that, overshadow some of the aspects that aren't so good.
Well, and even then, I really love the scenes where it's like her and Miko Hughes together talking. Like, there's a bit where he just talks about, why does God have bad things happen? She just very plainly says, I honestly don't know. Like, it feels like a very naturalistic thing of, obviously she's playing herself, but it feels very naturalistic of, like, just a mother trying to communicate to their child about, like, look, I don't know. Like, I'm a human, honestly. Like, there's that whole thing when you're a kid where it's like, oh, my parents are, like, super powered and they can protect me from anything. And this is really about a mother trying to hold up that shield, but realizing, like, I can only do so much. I still am human, ultimately. And I think that connection really works. And I do agree. I think this is her strongest performance, not just because she's playing herself, but there's a lot of natural moments that I think work really well. It's what I liked about her in the original movie. She felt like a very familiar, awkward teenager. I think that's kind of what some people criticize, what I think is a strength, is that she feels very awkward in a traditional teenage way. Versus here, this feels like a woman who has dealt with Freddy her entire life, and it's just something she kind of gotten used to. Like, I love the bit where after the talk show scene I talked about, Robert Englund is out signing autographs for kids, and she's in the doorway just like, I'm fucking tired, I want to leave. I'm so done with this bullshit.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and disagree with both of you there.
Okay.
As much as I like Heather Langenkamp, I think she's fucking terrible as an actress. I like her. I love the character of Nancy. I do like her in the original, but I think she's awful in this movie. I absolutely think she's awful. I think she's completely wooden. It feels like she's reading off cue cards for me the whole time.
See, I feel that way more about Dream Warriors, actually. She's kind of in that awkward phase where she's not too far removed from, like, the teenager she was in the first movie, but she doesn't feel like the adult I think she ultimately feels like in this one here. I think that's the most wooden where it doesn't quite work for me. As opposed to here, I think it feels a lot more sort of authentic. I think it's because she's playing a version of herself. I think it feels a lot more just like an exasperated person who's dealt with so much bullshit, and then especially all the shit she goes through in this entire movie. If anything, the few moments where it feels kind of awkward for me are just moments that feel traditional to, like, Wes Craven, like, issues I have, where it's like, I love Wes Craven's movies, a lot of them, but at the same time, like, why does he have to always have, like, a climax that involves, like, hand-to-hand combat when he can't do hand-to-hand combat very well? I never get that. He does that all the time in these fucking movies, and it's just, it feels like his sort of, like, go-to of, like, I don't know how to end this movie. They punch each other.
Well, I think the whole idea with him is he really gets into, with all of his movies and even interviews he's talked about, like, what the brutality of man versus man could be. So his whole idea is, it's just going to be fists and your natural weapons that we've always had against each other to really, prove a point. But yeah, he could not shoot a fight scene to save his fucking life.
Yeah. With him, why the Scream franchise was so successful and why overall, for the most part, all of those films are really good because someone else was writing and putting together how all of the structure was going to be, and then Craven was able to just focus on the direction. Yeah, he had his influences, but he had someone that was kind of guiding the ship in terms of the storyline is concerned. I feel like when he's writing his own work, it's kind of hit or miss. But again, it's like I can't help but love Wes Craven because he had so much creativity, was willing to try new things and always try something different. You have a guy who does Last House on the Left and then does Serpent and the Rainbow, which are both completely different films. With this film, I admire the fact that he tried something different and wanted to see what he could do with doing this kind of post-mortem on slasher films and kind of usher in a new generation of slashers and horror in general.
Which isn't it funny? Wes Craven single-handedly deconstructed and killed the original slasher boom, and then single-handedly revitalized it again with Scream. This was the send-off of the 80s slasher movies, and then he reopened the door again 2 years later.
It's pretty much passing the baton off with this one.
To himself!
Yep. From the left hand to the right hand, pretty much.
Yep. That's how fucking good he was.
Yeah.
He was a master horror director. I mean, he really was. Now, I agree with Thomas, and of course with you, Desmond, as well. There are certain of his movies that I'm like, like Hills Have Eyes. He's got some just genuine classics that will always be remembered. That's how good he was.
You get right down to that with another, I think, a great scene in this movie, which involves Wes Craven himself, where he's talking to Heather Langenkamp, but just like, well, I've been writing the screenplay, and it's kind of like diverged so much of my time and attention. I think that's what's keeping the demon at bay is writing this, and it literally is just him saying, so will you play Nancy one last time, and then looking at the screenplay, like, word processor, and it literally is saying it has the exact same dialogue as they're saying it, down to a fade to black, and it fades out completely. Like, that's ingenious, just in terms of just how he's really playing with, like, so many different levels. And even just the weird thing of, like, how this movie kind of bled into reality in a literal sense, where the whole recurring thing about, the earthquakes are happening, and this movie occurs during the big Northridge earthquake. Like, pretty much right after they're done with principal photography, the big Northridge earthquake happens in, like, early 94, and they have a second unit team shoot a bunch of stuff where you see the damage of it. It's this weird, almost cosmic, universal way of saying the movie in of itself is actually, like, kind of fulfilling its promise of, like, really blurring the lines between reality and fiction.
And I think that just, again, goes to show what an ultimate opportunist he also was as a director. I mean, to take something like that and just make it work for this story, I mean, it's almost a masterful stroke. To me, there's almost no better modern horror director of his time. I mean, the guy, he was so intelligent, so smart, and such a good director. To take the character that you created that made you who you are, and to completely flip it on its head and turn it and still produce something of this quality. I don't know anybody else who could do that.
Is there a specific example in this in New Nightmare that kind of really emphasizes that point to you, Adam, that we haven't mentioned, maybe?
Well, the fact that he goes back with, John Saxon, and with, Heather Langenkamp, and then has her in the same clothes and in the same bed and everything else, and Freddy comes out, peels out of the sheets. And by the way, Rex, what a cool idea. But just the fact that he goes full 9 with it, where they end up in this fucking crazy skull dungeon or whatever the hell you want to call it, and he just goes for broke with it, and yet you completely appreciate, understand, and believe it. Like, yeah, this totally makes sense. He just understands his source material, A, because he created it, but he appreciates what he's already done, pays respect to it, and also says, well, now I'm going to do it this way. This is my baby. I am changing it, but for all of you belong for the ride, I'm going to throw these little bones in for you.
Yeah, and it definitely feels like a definitive end to the franchise, whereas Freddy's Dead just felt like, okay, what the fuck was that? Like, that didn't feel like a proper ending. With this film, with New Nightmare, it feels like the proper send-off for A Nightmare on Elm Street and for the character of Freddy Krueger. As you were talking about Wes Craven and how intelligent he was, as I was watching this movie, and especially when he's on screen talking, I missed him so much. I was just getting really nostalgic watching this, where it was like, man, that's one of the greats that we lost, and he's made so many incredible films. And even though I'm not the biggest fan of Last House on the Left, I still appreciate it because it was his first film, and he tried something. He tried something different. Watching this made me appreciate him even more.
Well, and I think a lot of that comes to the fact that he started so late in his career, because he didn't do Last House on the Left until he was in his late 30s, right?
I think
he's
so.
36 or 37.
Yeah. So he was well into a more mature state at that point. And plus, he grew up a very devout Christian. He was going to become a pastor, at a certain point.
He was incredibly intelligent.
Right.
He was a teacher. I mean, So he saw the Virgin Springs, was like, you know what, I'm going to make this a horror film. The tagline alone has become so iconic for that movie.
Yes.
Keep repeating yourself. It's only a movie. It's only a movie.
It's very clear we need to do a Wes Craven episode at some point. But to get back to New Nightmare...
no, man, don't you do that. Not you, Thomas.
Before we start really dealing out the music of the heart here, as it were,
Meryl Streep.
What's so interesting, especially with like this movie and how he's playing into, especially like the religious aspects, is this feels very much like a movie about losing your faith, and not necessarily like literal faith in God, as much as like faith in like your own faculties and reality, and how when you work in like a industry that's so very much based on, hey, let's just throw out fiction, let's throw out like all sorts of stuff to like really entertain audiences, when that blurs so much, it feels like you don't really have a grasp on what it means to be human, as exemplified by, say, Bob Shea appearing in this movie with the very awkward stilted delivery, which I kind of love in this movie. It's just like, come on, Heather.
I love it.
Come on, Heather. Kids love horror. I love that.
Oh. Bob Shea. He wanted to be an actor so bad.
Oh, you can tell. And meanwhile, his sister Lynn is the much better actor who appears again in this movie after being in the first Nightmare on Elm Street.
No, what I will say about this film by itself is, I do agree with what Desmond said. To me, this is the proper send-off for the Freddy character. I mean, they took it full circle. I don't think, we didn't need the remake. I mean, stop. It was such a vapid piece of garbage. And Freddy vs. Jason is just a fucking fight movie amped up to 11. I know. Oh, it's terrible. This should have been it, and it would have worked perfectly.
I mean, I would definitely agree that this is the proper end to, like, Robert Englund and, like, that traditional version of the character, that series overall. I could still say, like, I wouldn't mind somebody actually with a creative vision taking on the Nightmare on Elm Street property, more so than any of the other slasher franchises, where it's like, oh, we're going to bring back Michael Myers, and it's like, oh, he's going to do the same thing. But with Nightmare on Elm Street, I feel like that has the most potential to do something very different with the franchise. That's the biggest bummer about that remake, is just that they recreate so many scenes from the original movie, as opposed to just like really doing something unique with the Freddy Krueger character, who is so malleable. You can do so much with, especially like modern like dream sequences you could do. I'd almost love for them to do something similar to like, I've been saying this since the Batman Arkham Asylum game came out. Do something like those Scarecrow sequences. Really emphasize on like sort of Freddy as
1,000%, yes.
Yeah, just emphasis on Freddy being sort of like controlling the environment, and really, I think there's a lot you can do. And you even mentioned that, Adam, that you would prefer to do, if they were to do it, to have the particular actor that Robert Englund suggested. For
Kevin Bacon.
Yeah.
Kevin Bacon as Freddy Krueger would be fantastic. He might be a little old now, especially when you get longevity out of the character. But I think Kevin Bacon would be really, really good. Back when they were talking about the remake, when they said Jackie or Haley, or I was endorsing fucking Billy Bob Thornton, to be honest. Skinny Billy Bob, creepy, weird, with his fucking soul patch. Come on, that's scary enough as it is. This is my soul patch.
And that remake single-handedly almost made Rooney Mara quit acting because the experience was completely awful. But back to New Nightmare, I wanted to bring up how Nico is in the hospital, and that doctor keeps mentioning about how Heather Langenkamp is in all of those films and these violent movies. I really appreciated the commentary of violence in media, and how there are certain people who try to blame violence on television or movies or video games. And I like that he brought that up, that Craven brought up, like, trying to insinuate that she somehow has failed as a parent because she's in these violent films. I just thought that was a really interesting commentary. Just showing that kind of moral panic that people have had about horror films, and especially with Wes Craven making that commentary about censorship, he's had to deal with tons of censorship in his films, especially in the Scream movies. So I really appreciated that whole angle that he took.
I mean, to quote that series, movies don't make psychopaths, they just make them more creative.
Right.
Which, by the way, MVP of the movie goes to that doctor.
Especially when she, when the glove pops up, it's just like, we have to make a quick cut. Going forward,
Has he seen your films?
Oh,
yes!
God.
Yes! I love this lady.
I will say my one sort of issue with the movie that apparently they wrote this in at some point, but it's kind of a bummer. No actual scene where Robert Englund himself encounters Freddy.
Yeah.
That's like the one really big missed opportunity.
I never thought of that, dude.
Yeah.
But I agree. That would have played the meta aspect up to a fucking 10. Yeah, Robert Englund should have been killed on screen by Freddy.
Especially if you almost played it off as like him as like the Freddy's Dead version of Freddy, and how completely destroyed he gets by it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what are you gonna do?
Even the painting that he's doing is like, just so dark, and it shows all those souls, and kind of Freddy, holding all of these souls captive. I love that visual and that imagery, and it also just gives you a little hint of what's going to happen later in the film.
Yes. But we could go on and on about New Nightmare. I think it's time we got to our final thoughts then here. Desmond, your final thoughts on Wes Craven's New Nightmare.
I think that this is a really good movie. It's not the best Nightmare movie, but it's still very good. It's Wes Craven. You're always going to get something interesting out of him. Whether you like it or not, what he's doing on screen, there's a certain appreciation of his craft that is there. Bringing back a lot of the original cast, and you see some of them at the funeral scene, which I loved that, just seeing some of the cast come back. And it's a really great send-off for the franchise, for the character. It really, like we were saying earlier, giving that post-mortem about horror films and slashers, and kind of just saying, okay, this is the end of that era. We need to bookend that, move on, and usher in a new one, which would become Scream. This is one that I'd highly recommend, especially if you haven't revisited it again. It still is an enjoyable watch, and it's got some interesting things to say about film, horror films, and media in general.
Yeah, it's kind of a bummer that this ended up being the lowest grossing one of the whole Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. I think just because it was too ahead of its time.
Yeah, I can see that.
But Adam, your final thoughts on New Nightmare?
New Nightmares is such a weird paradox of a film. If you want to see like we've already talked about, deconstruction of the slasher genre and a very smart film, this is it. But if you want to see a Freddy Krueger movie, it's also it. It's very, very expertly done. I think the script is the smartest of the Nightmare scripts. I just think it's damn near a perfect slasher sequel. To me, there's so much in this that's enjoyable. There's things that you can pick apart, of course, but you can do that with any film. But I just think it's a very, very fun, smart, intelligent movie, and it's Wes Craven at the top of his game, especially considering the character. It's the baby he birthed, and it's the baby he's put into bed. And I think it's expertly done.
I would give it a bit more praise in terms of the franchise lineup. This is my second favorite of the whole franchise. And with the other Nightmare on Elm Street movies, especially when I was rewatching a bunch of them before we were doing this episode, those movies are definitely ones where it's like, I watch them and I watch them for like, oh, here's this fun bit I remember, here's this bit. I know those movies very much by like set piece by set piece and how they go along. Versus with New Nightmare, what's so interesting is it feels refreshing every time I see it. It's the only one in this franchise where I feel like I gain something every time I watch it. It feels like there's so much subtext that's going on here, and there's so many great, powerful, emotional moments. There's a lot of great performances, I would argue, including Heather Langenkamp. I think it's definitely her highlight as an actress. And at the same time, it's also, I think, very scary while being very heady in all of this. I think it is the scariest I think Freddy's ever been. I really love, we didn't talk about that much, but the way his glove is designed to look like it's just a part of his actual being instead of like a glove, and how like it has like bones protruding and the actual knives are like growing out of his fingers. It's such a like weird, creepy, almost like fairy tale monster design, which this movie's building so much on, given the Hansel and Gretel stuff. It's very much saying that Freddy Krueger, despite being an 80s pop culture invention, is so of, like, these various monsters we've been seeing throughout all of history. Freddy Krueger is like Santa Claus or King Kong, in that despite being a more relatively recent invention in the last 35 years, his visage is eternal in some form. And this is the movie that really cemented that, and I think I do agree. It is the great sort of bow on this entire franchise, and one of the better slasher sequels. But that's the end of our discussion of our 2 films from the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. Well, let's go ahead and get into our feedback, because we ask all of you every Monday a feeler about, like, hey, what are your favorite and least favorite things about whatever topic we're doing? And so we asked you all about Nightmare on Elm Street, and so we have some people's feedback to read, including first James Rodriguez says, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors holds a very special place in my heart for being the first horror film I ever saw at the age of 7. Luckily, it still holds up as one of the series' best entries, complete with the wicked death through puppeteered veins. I would also call Johnny Depp's demise in the first film and the skin the cat scene in New Nightmare some of the most disturbing deaths in the series. As for worst, Freddy's Dead is top contender, along with the cartoonish death of Breckin Meyer in this laughable video game set piece. Rafe Telsh says, Dream Warriors is my favorite, as it's the point where the series really developed its voice, transforming from horror stalker to camp. The television death in particular, welcome to primetime, bitch, is a favorite. As for the downside, it doesn't get much worse than number 2, a movie that was already bad, but has seemed built up this unintended homoerotic overtone as time goes by. Nothing wrong with that, if they were going for it intentionally, but without developing it, it falls as flat as a porno intro scene. Scott Crawford says, I don't have one stand-up moment from from any category, really, of, best death scene or best film. Pretty much any time Freddy is on screen makes for an entertaining watch, no matter how bad the films get. The worst thing is the dream sequences always felt a little lackluster to me. Since he's a dream demon, you would think that the dream would be crazy and intense and otherworldly, but for the most part they are pretty generic, though some of the kills are definitely innovative. Shane Steele says, favorite, the look what I can do finger slice, turning Johnny Depp into a fountain of blood, and I'm your boyfriend now. Least favorite, Freddy exploding in 3D. Larry Sternshine, at Double H55 says, I hate most of Dream Child, but the motorcycle gag is pretty great. Burial Grid, at Burial_Grid, says, Kelly Rowland's character's homophobic contributions were definitely the low point of the series in Freddy vs. Jason. Those claymation sleep demons were pretty insufferable too. And I would say, amongst all this feedback, the big thing upon revisiting a lot of these movies is I would definitely disagree with Rafe about Freddy's Revenge. I think that one has aged the best out of, like, so many of these other ones. Where when I was younger, I would say that one definitely didn't hold up very well. Part of that is like some societal homophobia that I've grown out of, thankfully. If anything, the homoerotic stuff has become more and more interesting as time has gone on, and I would argue so much more baked into the movie. If anything else, what kind of sets that one to, like, not work as well is just some of the production value stuff. Like, say, the bit where the bird explodes is awkward, to say the least.
I'd argue it's all very intentional as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question that the person who wrote that movie knew exactly what he was interjecting into that film.
Yeah.
And I think it makes Freddy a very much more interesting character, where gender doesn't matter to Freddy. It's all a seduction. It's all everything. He just wants children, which makes it way more creepier and way more dirty too. I personally actually really like part 2. There's a lot of shit in it that's stupid. Like, I don't like the whole barbecue pool scene, but there's a lot of good in Freddy 2.
Well, plus, even in that sequence, I agree it's kind of, like, awkwardly staged, but at the same time, it has one of my favorite moments in the whole franchise, where the barbecue pit is, like, burning up, and he's like, you are all my children now? That's an iconic Freddy moment, I would argue.
Absolutely. They redid it in New Nightmare.
Yeah.
And I like the makeup on Robert Englund in that one. He has that kind of witch look, and he just looks so gross and grimy and scary.
I love the yellow contacts in the eyes. It was really cool.
As I've gotten older, I've grown to really love and appreciate Freddy's Revenge, and is how, Freddy is like a representation of repressed homosexuality, and it's Jesse letting that out. And the way the writer thought of it was like, oh, the only way to cure him is with this girl who tells him that she loves him and that true love wins over and he'll become straight. That's gonna fix him so he's not gay anymore. And I just found that to be so interesting. And
yeah, because historically that's worked ever.
Right. If you just repress it and go along, it's gonna be fine. You're gonna be straight.
Well, I would almost interpret it, I think especially upon this recent watch I had with it, it's more intended to be what you're talking about at the time. But I think with time it plays almost more as like, she is willing to accept Jesse for who he is and love him for who he is as a person, rather than the person who, like, everyone's trying to conflate him to be. The person, as you mentioned, that's so much more repressed, or in the case of Freddy, the person that he's trying to completely manipulate in order to get into the real world. The child who is completely unsure about their sexuality, who he's trying to prey on, and I think that it plays a lot more, I think, in that more interesting identity aspect to me now, in a modern context. And plus, I think it's also the last time Freddy was truly just straight up scary. Like, in that movie, he feels the most like a predator on a sexual level, in a really disturbing way in that one.
Oh, absolutely. And just the practical effect alone when he comes out of Jesse's body is one of the best practical effects in the franchise.
Yeah.
I think maybe Rafe needs to give it another watch.
As should anybody out there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, maybe look at it with a set of new eyes, or appreciate the subtext, and it's actually a really good, smart, kind of ahead of its time film.
What are some other moments that we really like from this franchise we haven't talked about, given our two films? What are some other ones that maybe were mentioned or hadn't been mentioned that really stick out amongst the other entries?
The puppet kill, part 3.
Oh, it's so gross and good.
Oh, I love that. That one gave me so many nightmares. Him laying in the bed, Freddy cutting himself down from his little puppet, thing, from his strings. Then he becomes bigger and then just slices open dude's like veins. And it's just making him walk around like a puppet, and you see the pain on that kid's face, and the music, fucking awesome.
That's why I think when I rewatched it, I dislike Dream Master so much more, is they introduce all these cool characters of the Dream Warriors in 3, and they're all dead by not even the halfway point of Dream Master, and so unceremonious.
Yeah. I will say, though, all of Tina in the first movie is fantastic. From her death to her being in the body bag in the hallway with the bugs coming out of her mouth and bleeding from the eyes and being dragged down the hallway. How fucking terrifying.
Yeah, especially when you're like in the shoes of Jesus Garcia, where you're just like watching all this happen. That's so terrifying.
Oh, yeah. And it's a perfect, almost like Alfred Hitchcock Psycho moment.
Yes.
Where you expect Tina to be the hero of the whole movie, and he just fucking brutally wastes her in the first 20 minutes. And then, of course, Johnny Depp being sucked into the bed, and I love the callback with Joey on the waterbed in part 4, even though I agree, they killed Joey and Kincaid and everything in part 4 so fucking fast. It's ridiculous.
I'm still pissed off about how they killed off Kincaid. That's the moment where the franchise takes a dark turn for me, where it's like, fuck you, Kincaid's awesome. And how dare you do that to him?
How dare you? And Joey was cool too. Where his voice was his weapon, and then you see him in part 4, and he's just talking like a normal dude. You're like, well, I guess you're fucking dead.
Yeah.
And no Patricia Arquette.
I was about to say, yeah.
Tuesday Night was okay.
Yeah, nothing against her. Like, she did her best, being dropped in the middle of a film where Kincaid and Joey are there, and they're not happy that it's Tuesday Night. They had become really close with Arquette. And I think that she may have been pregnant during the filming.
That was the reason, yeah.
The girl who became the main one's brother in part 4. The kung fu.
And his kill was so lame.
So bad.
So lazy.
And then the nerd girl. What a suck face. What?
Oh, God.
Oh, God. Oh, Rick, you little meatball.
I love soul food. That's one of my favorite really bad Freddy lines. I wanted to ask, so Adam, you've actually said this before. You have a bit more of a defense for Dream Child. It was your alternate pick for the good pick. You want to throw a bit of defense for that one?
Sure. I love Stephen Hopkins' directing for Dream Child. I think it's totally bizarre and weird, almost like MC Escher sort of shots in it, especially with the stair scene at the end. I love the idea that Freddy has come back by infecting an unborn child. What a cool, perverse, crazy idea. And it's one of the few that actually brings back characters from the sequel to the sequel, like from part 4 to part 5. And most of them play, well, not most of them, but Dan and whatever the hell her name is now.
I believe it's Alice. I believe is her name.
Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, Alice.
They got big parts. And just how batshit crazy is that you see the Freddy baby run around. I mean, nobody does that. I think it knows exactly what it is. It's trippy and it's weird.
One of the reasons it's not nearly as terrible as I think a lot of people say it is with like bringing back characters, it does a very impressive job of actually developing Alice's relationship with her father, who in 4 is like a straight up, very typical abusive dad stereotype. And I like in part 5 that they actually feel like they're kind of trying to rebuild their relationship. And that he's actually trying to improve himself, which you never see in like a slasher sequel.
Yeah, then they got the girl with the eating disorder, and they delve into that. They got the comic book kid, which is a great scene, Super Freddy. Oh, yeah, fucking awesome! It's a fun movie. It's way better than Dream Master, and miles better than Freddy's Dead. Good fucking God.
Agreed.
As we've pretty much beaten to death here, I think definitely.
Beat you to death.
Well, I knew this day would come. I think it's about time. It's been 78 episodes. I'm surprised this didn't happen earlier.
Out of Florida. Jesus.
Yeah, go ahead.
Anybody got $78? So I can fly into Orlando.
I can't wait to go to the Scream Park and get you. See, where I need to be on that Nightmare on Elm Street reboot. Come on, Warner Brothers, pay me, please. Boy. But we also had some feedback about our last couple episodes that I wanted to read here first. Ryan Marshall says about our Italian horror episode, I love both Cemetery Man and Burial Ground. I'm definitely going to watch Burial Ground at some point by the end of this month. Stephen D. at Waiting FTH says, I was late to the comments on this one, but I've got so much love for Italian horror. You definitely can't go wrong with Michele Soavi movies, and then having a film loosely based on Dylan Dog. I'm all there for it, in reference to Cemetery Man. And then reference to our Horror Anthologies episode, he says, I really enjoyed the Amicus movies and the first 2 Creep shows. And then Hunter Ellen at Bruja_baby says, Slither is one of the best movies I've ever seen, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I can't disagree with a lot of those, except Burial Ground is garbage.
Oh my god, it's so sleazy.
It's just sleazy shit. I mean,
I do movie nights at my place once a month. Double feature was 2 trashy, awful Italian horror films, and they were Burial Ground and Shocking Dark, also titled Terminator 2, and they were actually sued by, the folks who made Terminator 2 before Terminator 2 was released.
I will also say, in terms of the anthology stuff, I didn't mention this in our anthology episode, and because it's technically not quite a horror anthology, but it's a segment in an anthology movie technically, and it's a horror thing that I love watching every year. The animated Sleepy Hollow that Disney did.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
I watch that every fucking Halloween.
As you should.
Maybe my favorite bit of Disney animation, honestly, is that whole bit. It's such an incredible short film. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so good. That one stuck with me forever when I saw it as a kid. I still even remember the look of Ichabod, the look of everything. I love that movie, or that short, if you want to call it that. It's so good.
I've got to revisit that because I remember that scaring me as a kid, but also I was so into it. It was, good call. I got to rewatch that.
Yeah, it's definitely one to rewatch around. This is Halloween week. We're releasing this. It's one of the few Disney protagonists to be unapologetically like a gold-digging asshole the whole time. She's like, he just wants to marry that one girl just so he can get all that money. And
he's a foppish prick.
And he's a horn dog, and he's a weird like ladies man amongst the town, even though he looks like a beanpole. It's so great. Such a great bit. What are some perennial Halloween watches for you, Desmond?
So I would say Night of the Demons, Trick or Treat, Tales of Halloween. Of course, Halloween, the original I gotta watch. Poltergeist. A lot of the classics I tend to watch. One that recently came out that is going to be a Halloween staple for me is going to be Haunt, which I think is a fantastic slasher film. But yeah, those are typically the ones that I like to watch around the 31st is those movies.
All right. And, well, thank you for all that feedback out there. And we also want to thank some other people like Chris Oliver for the intro and outro music used on our show. Listen to more of his music at chrisoliver.bandcamp.com. Thanks to Emily Scarter for the art that we use for our show. And, of course, thanks to Mr. Desmond Alexander Peel. Always fun to have you on, as we previously had. Go ahead and plug yourself. What do you got to plug? Go ahead.
Hey, yeah, thanks, guys, for having me. And, yeah, I have a podcast and a YouTube channel called Desmond's Flicks. They're both a little bit different. The podcast is more free form. We pick 2 movies that we talk about. I have a guest on every single week. Upcoming episode is going to be anthology horror films, actually. And we're going to be talking about Tales of Halloween and Trick or Treat. And then my YouTube channel, Desmond's Flicks, coming up there is going to be a retrospective on the first Candyman film, as well as a defense of Halloween 3. And you can find me on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Desmond's Flicks. Look forward to seeing you guys, and thanks again for having me.
Oh, and thank you for having me on your show. If you want more Wes Craven talk, dig into the archives of Desmond's podcast to hear me talk about Serpent and the Rainbow, and Deadly Friend, Deadly Friend.
Oh, boy.
The basketball scene, that's all I'm going to say.
There's so much more to say. As we did. Plug.
I'm going to be on the episode here in a couple weeks, actually.
Yes, I'm very excited for that. It's going to be fun to talk a couple of exploitation films.
Yeah, it'll be interesting.
Which, of course, we'll promote as that becomes readily available. For more of us, please make sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at DEDBpod. That's where we put up those feelers every Monday, and also just throw out some other interesting little tidbits and such. And you can also email us feedback at all spelled out doubleedgedoublebill@gmail.com. I also have my own individual Twitter account at NotTheWho'sTommy, where you can follow my little thoughts and feelings. And I also do some writing at both marianithomas.wordpress.com and at truesuperherofans.com. That's I do some reviews for the WordPress site, and I also do some satirical superhero news at truesuperherofans.com. For the blog, I know I will probably have a review of The Lighthouse out around that time that this is coming out, and I'm very excited. I haven't seen it yet, but I love The Witch, so I'm all up for that. And also, of course, Willem Dafoe as a sea captain. For sure.
The party is going to play.
Yes. And Adam, you actually have something to promote this time, because very appropriate for the season, right?
I do. I've been doing custom pumpkins for years now, painting them for just my family and friends. But now I'm actually branching off into a money-making business, hopefully. I'm on Facebook.com/GhoulishGourds. It's all one word. I'm doing custom-made foam pumpkins, so they last. Clear coat them, custom do them. But I'm also going to be doing Christmas bulbs for ornaments. Anything you want, pop culture related. I specialize in horror art, obviously, but anything you want can be done. And shoot me a message if you mention that you heard about it on the show. I'll cut you a discount. For show.
He made me a little Shop of Horrors Audrey 2 one. It's adorable.
Yeah, I threw it away, though.
You didn't throw it away. You threw it into the fire, and then you sent me a video of it. It was really upsetting.
I did. And then I pissed on the fire to put it out.
As one does.
I was just like, well, at least he cares about safety, at the very least.
Right. I got a kid.
Like the responsible adult you are, yes, you took precaution. And for more mature adult content like that, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and wherever podcasts are available. And if you're listening on the ESO network, why not dig into the archives for the first several episodes? And make sure to rate, review, or at least share us around to give the show more visibility, if you can.
I mean, why not? is it really going to bother you? I tell you what, I love our listeners, but God damn it, hook us up. We do the shit for free, people. Oh, don't get me started.
Well, let's not get him started because we don't want to spoil Halloween. Which, by the way, happy Halloween, everybody! This is the week of Halloween, of course.
Yes.
A few days before the great October 31st. But right after October 31st is November 1st, and on November 1st, this very week, this Friday, that we're releasing this out, we got a new Terminator film coming out. Everyone wanted that.
Which I'm guessing is going to be a very big horror film as well, but for different reasons.
Well, actually, it's weird. The early reviews have come out, and everyone is saying it's the first decent Terminator movie since T2, which isn't saying a lot. That's such a low hurdle.
Anything.
No.
Yeah, that's it. No. Yeah. That's watchable. Oh, good.
I mean, to be fair, that's more than you can say for the other three that have come out since T2.
Maybe.
Well...
Maybe, but that's all
debatable.
That's all fodder for discussion for our next episode, which in honor of Terminator: Dark Fate coming out. Adam, we're doing a topic that's very close to our hearts. We've mentioned this man several times. We covered a couple of his movies. We are gonna do our big topic, the first one of November, all about Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yes, sir. I am a huge Arnold fan.
Definitely the same. Are you a fan, Desmond?
Oh, fuck yeah. I grew up on Arnold Schwarzenegger. Commando and Predator was like my childhood, along with Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yes, of course. We have all the horrors of Arnold to detail in our next episode. And we are going to go ahead and do our picking for next week because for those of you who might be new, at the end of every episode we do our picking, where in this case I have the 2 good Arnold movies and Adam has the 2 bad Arnold movies, and we've assigned numbers between 1 and 10 for both of those each. And usually we would pick a number between 1 and 10 ourselves to narrow down what our good and bad feature is for the next episode. But when we have a guest like the lovely Desmond here, they go ahead and pick our 2 films. So for my 2 good choices, Desmond, number between 1 and 10.
I will give you number 3.
All right. You know what that means? That means this is going to be a real party. We're going to see you at the party, Richter, without your arms, because we're doing Total Recall from 1990.
Oh,
fuck yeah.
Oh my god, I love that movie so much.
Such a great movie.
It's so good.
And then at number 9, I have my alternate choice, which appropriate for Terminator Dark Fate, was the original Terminator.
Oh my god, god damn it. Laundry day, nothing clean, right? Nothing clean, right?
Yes, but now I'm really curious about Adam's 2 bad picks. So, Desmond, go right ahead.
All right. 7.
And number 9, I have Junior.
Oh, no. Oh, God, no. This is the darkest note our Halloween episode could end on. No.
It's always darkest before the dawn, bro. And number 2, I had Terminator Genesis, whatever the hell it is.
Oh, no.
They're fucked either way, man.
Oh, I feel like Bruce Campbell at the end of Evil Dead 2. I'm just like, no. Why? No. Oh, God.
So, Total Recall and Junior. Well, that'll be something. God damn it.
Well, on that note, I'm going to just delve into this nightmare of a next episode. Just good night, everybody. Good night, bitches.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping through Amazon.com or the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.